Most brake calipers from front to rear are very, very similar. Inspecting and replacing brake pads. First, you want to make sure your bike is clean and free of any debris. Most calipers are alike. This caliper holds the brake pads on by a pin and 2 clips. Most other models will have the same pin, but you would remove the pin by threading it out using a hex head, an Allen head, or sometimes a screwdriver. But basically they're the same way, same pin. To remove these clips, I'm going to use a screwdriver to pop them out, then simply hold the pads and remove the pin. Now your brake pads will fall out. Inspecting your pads, first thing you want to look for is pad thickness. This metal piece is the brake pad backing, the plate. This material is your actual brake pad. A worn out brake pad would be very, very thin and getting very close to the metal. Sometimes you can wear all the way through the pad and rub the metal pad against your rotor, and this would tear up the rotor. If you notice that the brake pad is very thick on one end and the other is very thin, this is called uneven wear. If your brake pad has very uneven wear, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace your brake pads and your rotor, because the uneven wear will wear the rotor badly. These pads have very good thickness to them. Also, you would check for bits and pieces of your pad missing or broken off. These pads look very good. If you notice when you apply the brake that your brake lever surges or moves under pressure, you may have a bent rotor. What this bent rotor is doing is every time the bent part comes around, it pushes on the brake caliper piston, thus pushing your brake lever. If your brake rotor is bent, it's time to be replaced. Inspecting your rotor. What you're looking for on your rotor is very, very bad grooves worn into the rotor. You would feel the part that the brake pad rubs against also rubbing onto the part that is not being touched by the brake pad. If there is a very steep ring running around here, the brake pads are grinding into the rotor. Also, most brake rotors have a minimum thickness stamped into them. This minimum thickness is where the brake pads touch. You would measure how thick the brake rotor is. If the measurement is below the minimum thickness, it's time for a new rotor. Removing your rotor, you would do the same as your sprocket. Most rotor bolts are just bolts, but some have a nut on the back. Just like your sprocket, you would remove the nut first and then the bolt. These are just bolts, so you would just remove the 6 bolts in a star pattern, remove the rotor, clean the face of the hub up, make sure the face of your new brake rotor is clean, Loctite your bolts, and then torque to your specifications. If you have to replace your brake pads, it's a good idea to clean the area inside of your caliper, especially around your piston. This is the piston, because you will be depressing this piston back into the caliper, and you do not want any debris getting lodged in between. You can use brake cleaner or contact cleaner to do this, and some compressed air. Installing new pads. These are not new pads, but I would show you what you would be doing. You would use your old pads and place them inside the caliper where they belong. And you would take a screwdriver or two and place in between the pads and rotate or push. This would move the piston into the caliper. The reason for using your old pads is so that you do not damage your new pads. And the reason for moving the piston back into the caliper is that the new pads are a lot thicker and they need the space for the rotor to be installed in between them. When trying to depress the piston back into the caliper and you're having a very tough or difficult time, you may need to remove the cap on your brake reservoir. What you're doing is pushing the oil or fluid out of the caliper and up into the master cylinder. Removing the cap relieves the pressure. On this particular model, this is the rear master cylinder and this is the master cylinder cap or cover. On some models, the caps vary slightly. This model, the cap unscrews. On other models, there will be two screws holding the cap on. Installing your pads. I'm going to insert my pin just a little bit to make sure it's in place. And I can take my brake pads. Note, one brake pad has a piece of thin metal on one side. This brake pad goes towards the piston. If your new brake pads do not have this piece of metal on it, remove this piece of metal and pop it onto your new brake pad. It just peels off and pops back on. You want to insert your brake pads and push the pin through. What we've just shown you here for the rear brakes will be exactly the same for the front brakes.